Welcome everybody to another day of the Lawyers in Energy Network training series in partnership with Centurion Law Group and Broomshy Consultancy. My name is Rakiba Oloko and I'm your host for today. To handle today's session, we have with us two distinguished personalities who both work for the law firm of Details Commercial Solicitors. The first person is Mrs. Dolapo Kukoyi. She's the managing partner at Details Commercial Solicitors and the lead of the firm's energy infrastructure and power practice. And she has extensive experience advising clients on a wide range of complex transactions. Our professional experience spans across energy, power, gas, and renewables, project development, project finance, infrastructure development and finance, corporate commercial transactions, and mergers and acquisitions. She is one of the leading energy lawyers in Nigeria, having worked for government agencies, regulators, and private parties, institutional investors, and financing institutions. Mrs. Kukoyi combines a strong legal background and industry knowledge to add value to each transaction, and our attention to the intricacies of every brief sets her apart as a pillar of support to clients. She is also an avid speaker and thought leader and is passionate about encouraging the advancement of women in professional and business circles and increasing energy access in Nigeria and across Africa by leveraging private finance with the use of viable business and project models. Mrs. Dolapo enjoys expressions of music, traveling for leisure, and playing amateur golf. She will be speaking with us today on contractual relations in the African energy industry. With her is our colleague, Mr. Anthony Ezemama, who is an associate partner at the same law firm, Details Commercial Solicitors, and is the team lead of the firm's energy, power, and infrastructure practice. He regularly advises clients operating in the different value chain of the power sector on all aspects of their projects. Anthony's ability to understand and deal with complex legal and commercial issues, especially in relations to financing and development of energy and infrastructure projects, enables him to provide pragmatic solutions and value-added services to clients. Anthony is practical and pragmatic in his approach and willingness to go the extra mile in exploring solutions and options to difficult problems, which reflects in his expertise in conducting due diligence exercises for clients, especially in power-related transactions. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mrs. Dolapo Kukoyi and Anthony Ezemama. Welcome, ma.
Thank you very much, Rakiba, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. So I will be speaking first, and then my colleague Anthony will then take over at some point during the presentation. Rakiba, am I sharing screen?
Yes, ma, you can share your screen, ma.
Okay. Just confirming that you can all see my screen. So today we'll be talking about contractual relations in the African energy industry. I think when this topic was proposed, I wondered where to start from, because the energy industry is quite wide. You can be talking about oil, you can be talking about gas, you can be talking about power. but we've kind of choose to focus on power, but power within an integrated framework, looking at the entire value chain, of a power project. So you've already heard about who we are. And now in terms of the content, what you will be talking about today, I think first is to basically talk about energy contracts within the context of what we'll be discussing, which is within the context of a power project. And then we'll then talk about the typical contractual structure. And looking at the typical contractual structure, we've chosen to speak about certain contracts and how they are all integrated, how they all work in a power project. And then we'll then talk about key considerations for African energy projects. When I did the introduction to energy contracts and typical structure, I would also like to give context to why we are doing this. Well, not to speak for the organizers, but I can imagine the reason why we are doing this. And I will speak a little about that. That will then also inform what we talk about when we are talking about key considerations for African energy projects. So, in the context of this presentation, obviously, as I've said, talking about energy projects is quite wide, but we will focus on power projects. And the underlying objective, when you look at a power project, whichever way you look at it, whether you're looking at it as a large-scale project, or you're looking at it as one in commercial or industrial that is not so large, or looking at it from an on-grid perspective, the key thing is generating electricity, and that electricity being billed to end users. Now, there's a lot in that. There's a lot in how that power gets generated, and then distributed to getting into our homes. There's a lot in that contractual structure, that is very necessary to get right. And I think a case in point is the reason why we have a power sector the way it is, because there are certain things that we still haven't gotten right in terms of the value chain. And you really can't run away from doing those things right. You really can't run away from doing what is best practice as much as possible, to make projects work and to encourage investment. So we'll be talking about the contracts that need to be entered into, the parties in those projects, and the other parties in the project and their different counterparties. So in terms of the contracts we're talking about, it's power purchase agreements, it's fuel supply agreements, engineering procurement and construction agreements, operations and maintenance, original equipment manufacturing agreements. Mainly, that's what we'll be talking about. We won't be talking about financing agreements or concession agreements, really, but we will refer to them in context. So generally, I think just some key principles to kind of set the tone. One of the reasons why it just seems these things are complicated is because or energy projects seem very complicated is because they're capital intensive. I mean, if we as African countries, or we as industrials, or we as power companies, we as gas suppliers could just, get this project started, we would have our energy access numbers would be higher than what we have currently. But they are capital intensive, which means that oftentimes you have to go to external parties, for investment. And there are always a number of considerations that you have to think of in energy projects, and in projects like the way we're talking about power projects. One is the demand for the energy to be supplied. I say demand for the energy to be supplied is the fact that before you start any business at all, before you start a bakery to sell bread, you have to have an indication of who's going to be buying your bread, where your bakery will be, who are going to be your distributors, So you have to, the demand is important. And also not only that, because energy contracts are oftentimes long-term contracts, then you also have to ensure that you have reliable forecasts. So you may have an energy contract that spans 10 years, you understand, but things may change even before that. So it's something that I would say is still, you still need to continue to reiterate and still continue to check. I don't know how many of us know that, for example, in Ghana, they have an oversupply of power at the moment. Now, what could have accounted for that? A number of things. One is the fact that their distribution, they still haven't gotten their distribution right, and another is the fact that, perhaps they didn't do the forecasting to see what's the demand that we envisage, and for the supply that they were contracting to meet the demand. So these kinds of things matter. We are talking about an energy industry, and we need to be looking at it, from this perspective. Obviously, the ability of whoever is taking your power to pay for the power on a long-term and on a consistent basis. One of the reasons why, at least in the Nigerian market and across Africa as well, why we have issues with energy projects, in power space, is typically because government is often the off-taker and government is often unable to pay on a consistent and long-term basis. Either there are delays, and all of that. It's also fuel availability. If you are looking at an energy, a source of energy that requires fuel, that is not renewable for instance, then fuel availability, is important. Infrastructure is also important. And infrastructure from different perspectives. I have there, evacuation and distribution of the energy, but there's also evacuation and distribution of the fuel as well, which we will look at. And then, very, very, very importantly is efficient risk allocation. We can't overemphasize this. It's really, really key. Parties must always, risks must always be borne by parties best suited to bear the risk. And it's always important in looking at energy contracts, and if you're looking at an energy project, whether it's a small one or a big one or a major one, the critical thing is this: you must look at the entire chain. And what I mean is that you must look at everything that affects that project. Everything that affects that project, and see it as an integrated whole. Your project only falls on the weakest link. Your weakest link could be your gas supply. Your weakest link could be your end-use customer who can't pay for power. Your weakest link could be the off-taker who maybe is taking it from you to pay to end users. The weakest link could be the person who is running the distribution line that your power is going through. We always have to look at energy projects from an integrated whole. And I think this is very critical for every part of the value chain. So we've often had where, gas suppliers, for example, and I think we've learned a lot of lessons from that, where sometimes gas suppliers who have a portion of their gas going to the power industry, we're not really looking at, what the effect would be in terms of what's happening in the power industry, and how that would affect their projects. But they went along at some point to put in all the investment required, only to find that they were not getting paid as they should. So efficient resource allocation it can't be overemphasized. It is really, really critical. So I said I was going to talk about why this is important now for the African market, and I don't have any slides on this, but I just thought that this was something that's important that we need to put at the back of our minds. And I can imagine that this was probably some of the considerations for the organizers, of this, who have put this together and who are sponsoring this. The fact is that we all know that we are in the middle of an energy crisis in some way all over the world. We understand what's happening with, first of all, everybody's talking about an energy transition. We're talking about whether it's our own, whether it's us as Africa or the developed world, what our actions, mostly the developed world anyway, what our actions so far in terms of our energy production, how we travel, how we live, how it has impacted our environment, and wanting to be able to change that, and going to and reduce our carbon emissions. We hear everywhere about an energy transition. We hear everywhere about Africa talking about it needing to still industrialize, and not necessarily towing, the ideas of the West. And then this year we have the Russia-Ukraine war that has basically shown that everyone and every region, every country needs to ensure that they have energy security. And I think that that's one of the important reasons, one of the reasons why what we're doing here is important. And it's because the more that Africa needs to, in quotes, take its destiny into its own hands and actually be responsible for its energy security and supply from many perspectives. One being the fact that, so far, a lot of the funding has come from the West, even though the resources are here. A lot of the expertise and the capacity to do these deals have come from the West, even though the needs and the demand is here. But it's very clear that Africa is that next frontier, but it's not only a rhetoric. It has to be backed with solid action plans. And one of them is our ability to build our capacity to be able to do these projects. So understanding how these contracts should work, and perhaps coming to what our own African energy market would be like is very critical. And these are some of the things that we need to put in place. These are some of the things that we need to build capacity on, so that we can have an energy, we can have our own energy market and energy secure, our energy secure economies across our different regions. Some parts of Africa have gotten it right, like South Africa. Not entirely right, but they have gotten it right to a certain extent. Some countries have started to make some progress, like Kenya and Uganda, in terms of the strength of their utilities, but even though they still struggle, in some ways. But I just thought to point this out here, because I think for me, every time I do these things, there must always be a why. It's not only about just spreading knowledge, but the fact that this has been called for the Africa industry, then it means that there's a purpose to it. So that's about the slide. So going into typical contractual structure for energy projects, and as I've said, it's typical contractual structure for a power project. Now, this kind of, this oftentimes is not your typical power project. It's not always your typical, but we've just done it broadly. So sometimes you have government, sometimes you don't. So if you don't have government, let's leave government out, then you would be there will be an SPV or a power company here who would also be a borrower, or or an investing companies to lenders or investors. You have sponsors, and sponsors being the shareholders in this power company or any other investors that they have. Lenders and investors could be people who are providing equity or debt, but most here that we're talking about, yes, would be debt or equity. Here would be the project sponsors, project proponents, those who are shareholders, initial shareholders in the power company, the SPV that has been set up to do the project. And on the second level, you then have the different contracts, most of which we'll be talking about. You notice that the power company or the SPV then has to enter into all these contracts. The fuel supplier has to enter into a power purchase agreement with an off-taker here. Has to enter into a contract with an O&M contractor and a EPC contractor. Sometimes you find that this power company would have capabilities to actually do its own EPC and O&M. So you may not need to have, you would still need to have this in place if you have lenders who insist that they want to ensure that these services, that EPC contractor and O&M contractor, are being provided on an arm's length basis. And let me break it down a little bit. So you can have a power company that has competencies to also build, and you find this a lot in mini grids. And you can also find this with some IPPs who develop that competencies to be EPC and O&M. but with smaller projects we found it more prevalent. So what often happens is that the investors will insist that even though it's a related company that's providing the service, they would want to ensure that there's some kind of, whether a management contract or an O&M contract, that shows that they are actually providing the services, and you can actually hold them accountable to it. They would ask for the usual protections, everything that is required. Some of them would usually even ask for guarantees, because it's very important. What is most important to a lender or investor is that this part is working, and that power plant is working and is providing the power that needs to be provided to an off-taker, or in some instances to government, because you've entered into an agreement with either an off-taker or government that I will provide you power for on these terms, and if I don't, this is what happens. And then you then have on the fuel supply side, you have a fuel supplier who in some instances may need to enter into an agreement with a pipeline operator, and also with a fuel supplier. Sometimes that fuel supplier may also be an upstream supplier. So which would typically be for really big projects. But just using the Nigerian example, we have a lot of variants of this. You could have a fuel supplier who is doing virtual pipelines, for example, who is also then off-taking fuel from someone else who would be maybe an upstream supplier, or someone who is collecting from an upstream supplier, and would have other contracts backing how that fuel comes to you, whether it's CNG or LNG. And the interesting thing is that the SPV here needs to ensure that you understand every detail that has to do with how that fuel finally gets to you. You must understand the risks and understand that all those risks have been covered. And I'll give another example, maybe with virtual pipelines. You should see the upstream supplier contract to ensure that if what you signed for is 5 years, at least they have supply for that 5 years. You should understand how the logistics works. If you are talking about LNG, for example, how does the logistics work to get that part of fuel supplied to you? There's also the processing, because if you're a power company, for example, and you don't know how, you don't process, you have to agree with your fuel supplier how that LNG is going to be converted to the fuel that will be used, for your power, for your generating plants. There's also the cost around logistics. You won't even believe sometimes it's the cost around, if you are putting it on trucks, for example, you are doing CNG and you're putting it on trucks, the cost of the diesel that the trucks use is going to be a component, and it's going to affect you as well. Last thing I'll say on this slide is that you see that the dotted lines also connect all the way to the lenders and investors. And what we're trying to show you there is that in some instances, your lenders or investors will insist that they want to have direct agreements with your suppliers. Because again, as I said to you, every lender and investor, what is important to them is that the power plant here works, and everything that is required for that power plant to work, that they have a say in it. So SPV or power company cannot be managing an issue that may be prejudicial to the power plant, and them not knowing about it. They don't want an instance where, for example, maybe the SPV is not managing things well, and they're not able to pay their fuel suppliers, and their fuel suppliers stop providing fuel. That means that whatever money we are supposed to be getting from either government or, the lenders or investors can stop coming. So it's things like this where you then have provisions where lenders and investors are requesting for direct agreements, which basically gives them that right to be able to step in, where there's a problem, and hopefully rectify it and get the project moving. Okay, so that's about this slide. Just moving on. So we'll talk about power purchase agreements. So a power purchase agreement basically it's your main revenue contract. It's the central contract. It sits it sits at the center of everything, because the terms of the PPA determine what happens with everything else. And it's usually central to everything else. It's usually, it's usually the critical path. Once you signed your PPA, or once you have an agreed form of your PPA, it then affects whatever else happens on the other side, even though sometimes, you may have to be doing these things in parallel. But the terms on which you finally agree your PPA usually would affect most of your other contracts, because it affects, for example, if it's your EPC, it affects and you should ensure that, for example, if you sign the PPA, that you are going to deliver the power in 1 year. Your EPC contract, in terms of dates, it means that you are delivering the plant. Safe to say you should be delivering the plant in about 9 months, particularly if you have things like liquidated damages for any delays. Those kinds of things have to be taken care of in your EPC contract. Same with fuel. So if you signed a PPA in which you're supposed to deliver in 1 year, that means that you are supposed to have commissioned. You are supposed to also have commissioned within that 1 year. And for you to have commissioned, it means you have to have that fuel. So you have to negotiate your fuel contracts to ensure that you get the fuel supply, at least for commissioning, at a certain date, and you have a firm supply at a certain date when you envisage that you will have commercial operation. So there's always this intertwine between the two, and there's always this, but the balancing between not taking obligations on one side that you will not be able to be on another side. So it's usually a delicate balancing act, and that's why you have to have the right team, the right people and right advisors in projects like this, because it can be quite complicated. So power purchase agreement is the settlement, is the central contract, and you can have PPAs in different forms. I'm not going to go into a PPA. I think there's actually a session where you'll be going into PPAs and all of that. So I'm just going to be talking through the main principles. Some of the main principles, not totally exhaustive, but you can structure your PPA in different ways, and usually determined by a variety of factors. One could be, the duration and the magnitude of the demand for power. We see a lot of variance now, giving different experiences that consumers have or customers have, where you are seeing long-term and you're also seeing short-term contracts. However, the typical is usually long-term, and particularly if it's on the back of a new plant that has been built for that purpose. And what's the reason why? If I spend so much money, we established the fact that these projects are capital intensive. If I spend so much money building a power plant, I have to be able to get my money paid back, my loans paid back, and get a decent return. Now, oftentimes I can't get all that, in a way that would work for the buyer if it's not long-term, at least 10 years. And that's why models are produced to see, what the tariff will be, to be able to get that return and get that amount paid. So the duration and the ability of the off-taker to demand for power over the next 10 years is very, very important. That's what I was saying about the fact that, forecasting and planning, as a market is very important, because you shouldn't take on in a PPA what you cannot use. That's why some countries now have a stay on PPAs. Some countries in Africa, in fact, you can't do PPAs until you get a consent. A few African countries, I think Sierra Leone and I think Cote d'Ivoire, you actually can't sign on PPAs, I mean private sector, until you get a go-ahead or a consent. And that's because I think government has committed to certain PPAs, So therefore, if you are kind of pulling someone off the grid or having a private arrangement, it may, make things unbalanced, on the grid side. So duration and magnitude of the ability of the off-taker to demand for power is very important. Availability of alternative sources of power to the off-taker is also important. it's a different ball game when you're supplying the terms of negotiation, the terms of PPA for a buyer who has other sources of power. For example, who is getting power from the grid? If you're looking at maybe an industrial user or a commercial user. A commercial user or industrial user who gets some power from the grid and also wants you to supplement, the way you negotiate the PPA and how you negotiate it will be different from if you are the sole supplier. Type of technology is also important. PPAs for renewables are not often the same as PPAs for thermal contracts. There are certain things that differ. The take or pay mode, whether you have a capacity charge or an energy charge and how it works, are oftentimes different. With thermal contracts, most times you have a capacity charge which goes to the core of the infrastructure, debt service, and all of that. And then you have an energy charge that deals with fuel cost and operational costs. Now, that's a bit different when you look at the components of the tariff. For a solar, for example, it's different too. So there are usually differences in how the PPAs are drafted. Now, another determinant could be whether the seller is selling power on its own right as a generator or acting as a trader. I'm just using Nigeria as an example. We don't yet have that sophisticated market where we have traders apart from embed, but I think that we will get there where we have people who are intermediaries who buy that bulk power, from a generator and then trade that power to other suppliers. So obviously the terms of the PPA where you are buying directly from the generator and where you are buying as a trader and supplying to end users would also differ. Same whether the seller is proposing to dedicate an existing power station. So if you already had an existing power station with existing customers, there will be certain things that would not be as if you had, if you were building from scratch. Another determinant would be, the means by which the capacity generated will be evacuated, whether through a transmission network, whether through a distribution network, the nature of fuel you are using, and we talked about that. And then in some PPAs, you find that the seller is unwilling to risk taking responsibility for fuel supply. And we found that oftentimes in PPAs with sub-sovereigns or sovereigns, with states, or even governments. I think in Ghana at the moment, I think that what they're trying to do is for government to take responsibility for the fuel. So government is actually be negotiating some of their PPAs, at the moment, and taking responsibility for the fuel. Because at the end of the day, really, if government is your off-taker, and depending on how they pay, you may stand the risk, you may stand the risk of, for example, your security with the gas supply being taken away because government hasn't paid you. So how some projects have now been structured is that government will take responsibility for that fuel supply. And even in Nigeria, with some of the interventions that have happened on the on-grid space, that is indirectly what they are doing. Because the interventions that CBN gives is to ensure that the gas suppliers and the GenCos get paid, before we even talk about distribution. So those are some of the things that determine how a PPA will be drafted. Other key considerations, as I said, I'm not going to go into clauses at the moment. I think you're going to have another session where someone will take you through those, but I'm just walking you through some key clauses in the key considerations in the PPA. So for example, if it's a new plant, most times you have conditions precedent. What are those things that need to be in place before the agreement becomes effective? And why is this necessary? Energy contracts are not the typical contracts where you immediately say that a contract has become fully effective when you sign. Okay, so there's someone who is actually making doodles on the slide. The name is Emmanuel something. Please, if that's your name, maybe you have, I don't know, maybe someone, you have a child or someone playing with the screen, or maybe the person is being mischievous. Please, can you stop it, please? the name of the person is Emmanuel. Emmanuel something, I can't get the surname. I don't know if someone on Rakiba, if someone on your team can please check this. Okay. So the conditions precedent are important because certain things have to be done before the contract becomes effective. For example, I talked about the interplay between a power project and fuel supply, and sometimes even infrastructure. You can't have a power purchase agreement become effective if the infrastructure to be built, for example, for the fuel supply, or the infrastructure to be built for distribution is not yet built, or the infrastructure to connect the gas supply is not yet connected, or the guarantees that are required to be in place, or the land access, for example, maybe a land lease supposed to be secured. Those are some of the things that would be conditions precedent before the contract becomes effective. And this is to ensure that the contract doesn't start running until certain things are done. Project timeline is also obviously important and is one of the things that determines the conditions precedent. You would also have seller obligations. Seller's obligations and buyer obligations. What would be seller's obligations? What would be the buyer's obligations? Land access rights is very important. You require land access both for the plant itself. Sometimes you could also require land access for rights of way. All of us as lawyers, I think it's a legal maxim that whoever owns the land owns everything on it. So you can't be building something without having the right land access rights or the right land ownership rights or land title. Very important. Pricing is also important. I talked about that in the last slides, having a capacity charge or an energy charge, what the components are. Most times for PPAs, you have a take or pay. So take or pay basically is that if you don't take all of the power, you still have to pay for it. You pay for it. There are usually balancing mechanisms for power that you don't take, that can somewhat be reconciled. And take and pay is I pay for what I take. You often would not get take and pay, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. They do exist, but oftentimes again it depends on how the PPA is structured. Let me use an example. For example, I think that you're likely to see a take and pay where the off-taker, the seller has other suppliers that they're supplying. And then you're just one of those suppliers and you're not the core supplier. You're not the anchor customer. So you may have take and pay there. And with take and pay, of course, metering will be very important because you take what it is that you pay what it is that you take. There's also things like indexation. So because these are often long-term contracts, should my pricing and everything stay the same? Oftentimes, there's a foreign exchange, particularly for us in Africa, there's usually a foreign exchange component of our contract, and that's because we are either borrowing in foreign exchange, or we are buying gas that is denominated in foreign exchange, or we have an O&M or EPC that is denominated in foreign exchange, or we have some costs that are foreign exchange based. So that's one is foreign exchange, two is maybe, for example, energy price, like gas prices, for example. If you don't have what is called indexation, or the fact that there's inflation, we all see that across the world now, inflation rates are rising. Now, if you had a PPA that didn't consider all of those things, some people will be in a rut right now. If you didn't, in the West or in the UK, for example, they haven't had inflation rates increase. I think in the last 20 years or so. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think in the last 20, they haven't had inflation rates like they've had, between last year and this year, and it's increasing. And we have the same in the US. We have rates increasing. So that's the purpose for indexation, to envisage changes. Sometimes you have indexation clauses that would say, if, for example, inflation rises above this, most times we use US CPI, because our own index, I'm talking about our own being Nigeria. Nigeria's index is oftentimes based on food prices, so it's not oftentimes reliable. And because we have a lot of reliance on foreign exchange, because we do not, again, produce our own equipment and all of that. Most times we will do US CPI and all of that. And, you know, with all that is going on in the world now, when we are doing this contract, we even have to look at what we are doing and seeing that is indexation modes we're using before, do they work? You know, do we have to modify them? Foreign exchange convertibility or conversion, you know, what aspects of the tariff we land on foreign exchange is also very important. You know, foreign exchange convertibility is also very important. I've seen contracts where the off-taker is saying, I can't take responsibility for foreign exchange. I can't pay you in foreign exchange, and I can't determine it because I don't get paid in foreign exchange. I earn my revenues in Naira. And you see that a lot of times the parties have to be negotiating the best way to mitigate foreign exchange risk. It's a really, really big issue at the moment, particularly, at least in this part of the world, in Nigeria, where it's even more difficult. There are no restrictions on convertibility and repatriability. However, there's an issue with availability of foreign exchange. So if the revenues are coming in Naira and investors still need to repatriate, you know, they need to be able to hedge their risk, because buying from the black market would be very detrimental, both to the tariff and to the investors. So those are some of the things, and this is the reason why we say that in doing risk allocation, you are looking beyond just the project. Sometimes you are looking at the macroeconomics. Sometimes you are even looking at the political, if you are dealing with a sovereign or a sub-sovereign, sometimes you are looking at the political risk as well. You are looking at changes in government. You are looking at what could happen, change in law. You know, there's also change in law risk as well. What if a law comes out that is adverse, you know, to your business? So things like that. So moving on, because I need to actually get going and let Anthony take up. I think I have one about outages, maintenance, and alignment. So essentially, remember, if we go back to that last slide, the slide that had the schematic, you would see that there are a number of contracts now. And for each of these contracts, there are always maintenance regimes. There are outages regimes. So certain times of the year, they are allowed maybe 5 days of outages, maybe 1 week of maintenance. I'm using that as an example. Now, you always have to ensure that the maintenance and outages regime are somewhat aligned across the PPA, the GSPA, you know, the O&M. You know, you have to ensure that the maintenance times are somewhat aligned so that there are no gaps, which oftentimes can be a nightmare. And we on the lawyer side always have to also work with the technical people to be able to come up with the drafting. There's also force majeure. You know, what happens in a force majeure, what kind of force majeure, and this also depends on who your counterparty is. You know, if it's a government counterparty, oftentimes the typical provisions is that, or if it's a political force majeure, they will take responsibility. You know, if you have to terminate, if it's a prolonged force majeure, they will pay you compensation. You know, if it's a private party, sometimes that also happens. So in different instances, there are different provisions that you can put in. For this, payment security also very, very important to ensure that on the sell side, their payment is guaranteed. And this, again, remember that we have just more than the PPA. There's also the gas contract. Payment guarantees are also important on that side, and it's important that you are able to ensure that whatever it is you are getting on the power side will be enough for what is required on the gas side, for example. Standing payment orders, and the thing with payment security is that it can come in different ways. It can come in form of bank guarantee, it can come in form of irrevocable standing payment orders when you're talking about government. For a lot of sub-sovereigns in Nigeria, for example, developers prefer to use irrevocable standing payment orders that basically creates an obligation on government at the point of their revenue. So where they can actually draw on either monies that have been deposited with a bank, or monies that have been guaranteed or kept aside, or would I say a contractual obligation on the government to pay immediately if they default. And then I've also talked about, lastly, I've talked about the ability to assign a PPA, for example, for vendors, by direct agreements. And sometimes you even find that in the PPA, saying that you have to allow for direct agreements to be signed. Okay. So with gas sale and purchase agreements, for gas supply agreements, that basically facilitates the sale and purchase of gas by the project company. And again, it can be structured in different forms, depending on dynamics of the transaction, and it's determined by a number of factors. The term and quantity of the purchaser's demand, and alignment to the PPA, I've kind of alluded to this. The availability of alternative sources of gas again. Now, for some gas supply agreements, it could be that we've seen this increasingly where we have a power plant where they actually sign like 2 or 3 different PPAs, GSAs with gas suppliers, and they are usually not very long term. Some are short term, and that's because they are considering having alternatives, particularly for smaller plants where they cannot afford not to have gas supply. A lot of problems that we see, problems that we often see with smaller gas power plants is the fact that when they rely on one supplier, they tend to have a lot of outages. If, for example, they are getting LNG or getting CNG, and there's a problem with the logistics. So sometimes what they even do is have two or 3 different suppliers. So obviously, if you are doing 2 or 3 different suppliers, the terms would not be as extensive as if you were doing one supplier. Other considerations is whether the seller proposes to dedicate an existing gas field, a new gas field. That is also important, because if I, as a gas supplier, is going to dedicate just one gas field to a power project, then it means that I have to ensure that the power project is able to pay me, and I have to secure, my payments. I have to ensure, and even on the power project side, to the gas supplier has to assure them, that supply will be made. Now, just talking about that same issue and going to the next point, you often find that with bigger projects where you are looking to a definite gas field to supply that gas, then there needs to be due diligence about, what kind of reserves that field has, and if anything happens, what would be the eventuality? What would be the impact or the implication if, for any reason, what you estimated the gas reserves to be is not what it is? Then there has to be an implication, and that actually has to be covered, in the gas supply agreement. And this obviously is one of those risk allocation, issues that you need to look at. Where we say, look at the entire chain and envisage the risks and what mitigations you put in place. One very, very critical point, which is the last point on this slide, is whether or not the gas needs to be transported over a third-party gas pipeline infrastructure. So to the extent that you also now need the gas supplier is not the one who's transporting the gas to the end user at this point, being the power plant, then you have to ensure that your contract takes care of any issues around third-party gas supply. What will be the point of delivery? Who takes the risk from that point of delivery? So if, for example, and let me just give an example here, if a power plant is in point A, and the gas supply plant, or the gas processing plant, for example, is at point B, and in between point A and point B is, let's say, 10 kilometers, and you need a gas pipeline to get to point A. Now, you can't, your gas transportation agreement or gas transportation arrangements must ensure that when that gas goes into the pipeline, it gets to a place where that point A, not at a place where the power plant cannot take responsibility for it, but exactly where the power plant needs it. Now, if it lands at a point where the power plant cannot take it and somebody else has to take it from there to point A, that is another open risk. So again, this is just talking about the fact that we also always have to look at every detail, to ensure that all risks are covered. So key considerations, basically some of the provisions of a GSA, conditions precedent, seller's obligations. I talked about conditions precedent and timelines. It's the same principle as well. What are the things that need to be in place for you to be able to make this gas supply agreement effective? Now, if it's supplying to a power plant, obviously you must ensure that the power before commissioning, you essentially the power plant is at a certain state of completion, before you activate the GSA. And it's a delicate balancing act. You also have to, also prepare for and envisage where there could be delays on either side. These are oftentimes affect project timelines, completion dates, and all of that. Seller's obligations, buyer's obligations, the take or pay obligations also work here. Now with gas, it could be a little, it's a bit different, because then you are also talking about if I either take or pay. If I don't take it, at some point I can take it as makeup gas, and all of that. So dynamics around that. Then there's also delivery points. Now, key thing about delivery point that I've said in the other slide is that, delivery point is where risk passes. Once we agree a delivery point, remember my example about point A and point B. If my delivery point is point A, as soon as gas supplier, ensures, or gas transporter ensures that gas gets to point A, my risk, I've taken my hands off. So I've left the risk to the power plant. However, if I drop it at a point that is not at point A, then somebody has to take responsibility for that, because there's still a risk of how it can get to point A. So delivery points are very important. And when we are drafting, when we are drafting clauses on delivery points, you have to ensure that the delivery point works and there are no gaps, which is why you also have to be talking to the to the technical people on the technical side to ensure that what has been described. You find, I'm sure a lot of you know, that delivery points are often times descriptions. So you rather say at the bus bar of this or this and that. It has to be a specific description, which oftentimes you have to confirm with the technical guys. Quantities and nominations is also important. Basically nominations is the fact to say that I nominate, or I propose that I will take this amount of gas at this time, and it's on the basis of that gas will be supplied to you. Now the process for doing that, how it's done, at what point it's done, it's very important and usually outlined in the agreement. Specifications are also very important. Remember again, there is the ultimate consumer of that gas is a power plant in this case. So the specifications of the gas have to be one that ensures that it doesn't damage that power plant. So oftentimes there has to be a collaboration between either on the EPC side or the O&M side, or the OEM side, of what specifications of gas would work for that power plant, and what the process is for ensuring that those specifications are met. That's why you typically have an annexure that has the gas specifications. Usually, I hear that dry gas is better, for power plants. If you have liquids in the gas, it can actually damage the equipment, and you typically also have provisions that state that if for any reason you take gas that is not the right specification, at the time that you know that is not the right specification, how you notify, what happens after that, if there's damage, how that damage will be paid for, and all of that should be well specified, in your GSA. The pricing, how the pricing works, whether there's a foreign exchange denomination, whether it is based on Naira. Most GSPs now, at least in Nigeria, could be denominated in dollars but payable in Naira. the payment period, how the payments are made, invoicing timelines and all of that. What is even in the invoice, how the invoice will be made, what are the components of the invoice, same for the PPA as well. I've talked about maintenance and outages and how you have to align across the value chain. Force majeure, termination and termination compensation, also very important. Let's remember also that if for example, that GSA is based on a dedicated gas field, for example, or a dedicated gas infrastructure for that power project, then it even becomes more intricate, because that means that the gas supplier has put in all that infrastructure because of your power plant. So if he has done that, then it means that, if for any reason you are not able to continue the project, you are not able to pay your bills, then and there's determination, then you have to pay for whatever it is that has not been paid to the lenders, for example, for getting that infrastructure standing. And that's one of the reasons why lenders will be very interested to know if there's anything going wrong, for example, in the gas supply side, because they don't want that to happen. It's in nobody's interest. And that piece of infrastructure is already standing and has to be paid for by someone. So those are some of the issues that play out. Payment security I've also mentioned. So the gas transportation agreement, same principles. This is just essentially gas transportation. So it's an undertaking, of by a pipeline operator. Sometimes you have a mixture of a gas supplier and also an operator, who undertakes to accept gas from one user, from one point to another point, and sometimes return the gas, as well. But for the situation of a power plant, it's typically going one way, except of course, maybe where there are issues around specification of that, but it's usually going one way. Now, for this contract, it's usually based on the tariff for the transportation, and that tariff for transportation can have different components. As you see, we have a fixed and a variable tariff in it, because infrastructure has been put into place that enables you to move that gas. So the cost of that infrastructure, in other words, has to be recovered. And that's usually the component, of the gas tariff, apart from the fact that there's also a cost, an operational cost of moving the gas from one place to the other, of administering that whole process. So what are the key considerations? The capacity of gas, the duration. If this power plant at point A, and there's a gas pipeline, and there's gas supply at point B, you can't have the PPA being 10 years, the gas supply agreement being 10 years, and then the GTA being 5 years. There's going to be a problem. Who's going to supply the gas the remaining 5 years? So there has to be an alignment through that process. So if there will be any issue that may stop, for example, the gas transporter within that 10-year period from supplying gas, then you have to be able to mitigate that risk. So the duration of GTA is important. The delivery point of the gas, I've talked about that. Metering the gas, very important, because in metering, you are looking at quantities. In metering, you are looking at what it was that was delivered. Because if I, at point B, sent 100,000 scoff, I'm just using an example, 100,000 scoff of gas, at point A, where it's coming at, it must be that, at least we must know how much it is. We must have known how much it is that we are supposed to get there. If it's not, if what you are bringing to point A is not what I expect, then there's an issue. And the agreement should talk about how that's dealt with. Now, with most bigger pipelines, you also have the fact that there's commingling of gas. They are not only taking one person's gas most times. Where you are talking about a big transporter, they could be taking, other gas from other gas suppliers as well. So it's also important to ensure that whatever they're delivering to you is what was contracted to be delivered to you. Otherwise, there will be issues. There is also tariff. We've talked about that, and nominations. Same way with the gas supply is also with nominations with the gas transportation as well. And gas specifications are also very important. particularly with commingling. So it's a delicate balance and a delicate process. If you are a major transporter, for example, and is in that same pipeline that you're doing wet gas, is in the same way you're doing, it can Emmanuel S. Stop doing this, please. It's really distracting. So if you have wet gas and dry gas coming at the same time, obviously there could be issues where another person's gas would affect another. Another thing to say about just with respect to this is also servicing of the gas pipeline. Very important that your service regimes and maintenance regimes are all aligned. So I'll hand over to Anthony. It was very long. I'll hand over to Anthony to take us through construction contracts, the construction parts and the O&M, which is basically the O&M and EPC. And then I will take the very last slide. I hope this has been useful. I think then we'll take questions after. Anthony, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll be taking us through the construction of energy contracts. Mrs. Kukoyi has provided a whole lot of foundation on the contract.
Anthony, we can't see you. Your video is not on.
My video is on. Me?
It's not on, and then your audio is a bit iffy. Can do something about it, please.
It seems we've lost him to network issues.
I'm sure he will join back shortly.
Okay, ma'am. While we wait for Mr. Anthony to join us, let us take a short break. Thank you.
Hello, can anyone see me now?
Yes, we can. Welcome back, sir.
Apologies, I had a network issue.
No problem, sir. You're welcome.
Okay. Please, can you go back? Do you have the document open?
You have to share it from your side.
Okay.
Can you do that?
Fine. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Can anyone see my screen?
Yes, we can, sir. We can see your screen, sir.
Okay. So Mrs. Kukoyi has talked about things you need to know from the project's proper side, the power purchase agreements, sourcing for gas to power the power plant. Now, I'll be talking about the construction side, because when you talk about the energy projects, there are certain facilities, there are certain infrastructures, there are certain equipment that you need to put in place to be able to meet the demand for energy. So I'll be taking us through on that. So as I said earlier, of course, to deliver power to the end users or to the agreed off-taker or off-takers, you need the power plant in place to be able to do that. You need a distribution network in place to be able to do that. You also need certain other equipment in place to be able to do that. So to do that, then that means that the project company, to the extent it doesn't have the in-house capacity, may need to contract with third parties to be able to put those facilities in place. Now, there are different construction contract models that can be utilized to be able to achieve the goal of constructing what you want to construct. You can have the design and build structure. So essentially, the project company engages a third party who does the design and can also then engage another contractor to then do the actual building of the power plant or of the distribution network or of the gas storage facility, for instance. You also have the EPC construction contract. So in this case, the project company simply engages one contractor to oversee the entire project development and completion. The EPC contractor will take over in constructing the power plant or the distribution network or whatever that is being constructed. You also have the engineering, procurement, construction, and management contracts. So the way this one works is that the project company here engages each of the respective contractors. So for instance, we are talking about power plants. It can engage a contractor that will be responsible for the design of the power plant, engage another contractor that is going to be responsible for procurement, and also engage another contractor for actual construction and commissioning of the plant. Then it then engage a service provider called the EPCM contractor to oversee the projects on his behalf. There are several dynamics, right? And certain things may require you to choose a particular model over another. So for instance, if you have a sophisticated project company, right, that has the internal capacity, the model it may adopt to bring the project into life may be a design and build or EPCM contract, right? Because it has the capability to assume certain risk in relation to that project. On the other hand, if you have a project company who is not too experienced, then perhaps the better model to execute that project is to go through the EPC route, whereby all the risk, all the associated risk are then transferred to the EPC contractor to assume on behalf of the all parties, essentially. So you have to look, also cost is a very key factor. We all know that EPC contracts, so of course, if the EPC contractor is assuming that's so much risk, it should be adequately compensated for assuming those risks. So that means the project cost may be very high in an EPC model as against having EPCM model or having a design and build where you have different contractors taking up different things, right? Another thing to note is that if you decide to do the EPCM model, then of course you should also know that there is a possibility of having dangling risk that are not adequately ring-fenced and allocated to a party. So you also need to think about how you can mitigate or manage those risks. And this is where your project, your EPCM contractor comes in to assist in managing some of those dangling risks. Okay, so I have, as I said earlier, to bring this project into life, certain equipment, certain infrastructure needs to be in place, and you can have construction contracts for each of those elements. So for instance, you have the generation plant. The generation plant needs to be constructed on the back of a contract, right? You also have the distribution infrastructure. This also depends on the type of energy project or power project we are talking about here. There may be need for a distribution infrastructure to be able to evacuate that power from the power plants to the off-takers or to the buyers, right? Then also depending on the source of fuel. If we are talking about, for example, gas, or if I'm talking about LNG here, then there is a need to have a storage facility where to store the gas that will be fired up to generate the electricity. So all these infrastructure needs to be put in place by the project company. And we expect that there will be, depending on the project structure, you may decide to give all these on one contractor to assume and to undertake, or you may decide to award different contracts. I'm going to shed more light on the EPC, EPCM, especially I'm going to focus more to talk about EPC and EPCM. Okay, so I have talked about earlier EPC. So what I'm just explaining here is to just show us a schematic that depicts a typical EPC structure. So in an EPC arrangement, you have the employer or the project company sitting on the top. The employer then engages the services of an EPC contractor to construct the power plant or distribution network or whatever you are putting into place, to construct that. And essentially, it pushes the burden and risk associated with that project on that EPC contractor. Then the EPC contractor on itself, we go back and engage certain subcontractors to undertake different aspects of the project. So for instance, here you have, it can engage an equipment supplier to supply the plant. Can also engage another installation contractor who will be responsible for the installation and the construction aspect of the project. It can also engage the design contractor who is going to design the power plant. So this is a typical EPC structure. Okay, so what are the key features of an EPC contract? Of course, number one is it is a turnkey contract. So when you hear a turnkey or single contract, it simply means, hey, I'm just giving you money. The only thing I just want to see is that hand over the key of this power plant so that at the commissioning date or the handover dates, I'll just go in there, turn the key and start the contract. And start the power plant, and that's it, right? So here there is just one contract between the project company and the EPC contractor. The EPC contractor assumes the entire role. As I said earlier, different considerations may account for you adopting either EPC or whatever model you wish to adopt. It all depends on a whole lot of factors. Both have their own merits and demerits, which I'm going to talk about in subsequent slides. But one demerit of an EPC contractor, or sort of an EPC contract model, is that note that in terms of tax efficiency, it is not tax efficient because especially when we are talking about a cross-border transaction. Once you award, if you read the provisions of Section 13(2) of the Companies Income Tax Act, you will see that once you award a turnkey contract, right, that contract is automatically liable to tax in Nigeria, irrespective of where the contractor is. or where the contractor will be executing the contract, right? So there are different considerations to note in deciding which kind of model. I'm going to talk about this in greater detail in subsequent slides. Also, another key feature of an EPC contract is that most of the risk, as I said earlier, is transferred to the EPC contractor. The EPC contractor will assume the risk on that project. Another key point is the pricing is essentially typically modeled on a lump sum basis. Then payment can then be on milestones, right? When I talk about EPCM, I can then highlight how this differs from EPCM. Then, of course, in an EPC contract, you expect that there should be payment security. The contractor will typically expect to get paid as at when due, and in order to backstop any risk that is associated with non-payment, it may insist that the employer provides payment security to backstop his payment obligation. Okay, another key point to note is that there is a fixed completion date. So here, I'm giving you contracts on the basis that you are going to complete this project in the next 1 month, in the next 12 months, depending on the arrangements. When you get into the EPCM regime, you may see that completion may not totally be in your control because you have different contractors doing different things and you are chasing different contractors, right? Here, you just have one contractor who you are holding on to deliver the project on the agreed completion dates. Okay, okay. Another key point to note here is that there is a detailed performance testing regime. For each milestone that is being achieved, you do performance tests to ensure that the project is being executed in line with the specifications. Oh, okay. So I've talked about the EPC contracts, whereby the employer engages only one contractor to undertake the entire project on his behalf. Now, I am going to talk about the engineering, procurement, construction, and management contracts, where the employer engages different contractors to undertake different aspects of the construction, or different aspects of the construction, and then appoints an EPC contractor, or call it a project manager, or a service provider to oversee the project on his behalf to ensure that the project is done in line with the agreed specifications. However, the contractor will also assume in this model, the contractor has some risk as well to assume, because he's putting himself out there that he has the competence to engage these guys directly. Okay. Okay, so what are the key features of EPCM? The one point I'm going to note is that the EPCM contractor performs professional or technical services, but has limited responsibility for the actual construction and quality of the products. As I said earlier, the employer will assume considerable risk when executing the project under this model. Okay, the next point is that the EPCM contractor manages the contract as the employer's representative. It takes care of managing the procurement process, perform cost estimates and cost estimates. Then it also receives a fee for providing the technical services. So my slide here my schematic here tries to explain the EPCM contract model. So you see the employer here, or the project company, and you see him engaging the EPCM contractor, as well as also entering into construction contracts or supply contracts directly with with other contractors in relation to this project. Okay, so now I'm going to just try to highlight some of the, to do a comparison between an EPC model and as well as an EPCM model. So in the case of an EPC, the EPC contractor is responsible for dealing with the entirety of the project: design, construction, procurement, supply, whatever. He's solely responsible for doing that. On the other hand, in the case of an EPCM regime, the EPCM contractor provides professional services relating to design and construction management as a representative of the employer. As I said earlier, the employer will also engage the design consultant. Is going to also engage other contractors that will assume direct responsibility in that design, in the construction. The EPCM contractor essentially oversees what they are doing. Okay. Another key distinction is that the EPC contract has a high level of control. The EPC contractor has a high level of control over the entire project. While on the other hand, the employer has a high level of control over the project in an EPCM regime. Also, in the case of EPC regime, the EPC contractor is in control of the construction and manages the other subcontractors. While in EPCM regime, the employer ultimately is responsible for the construction, with the EPCM contractor as his assistance, as providing assistance. Then also, in the case of EPC, prices are usually fixed, but indeed the prices are also high because the EPC contractor is assuming a whole lot of risk. In the case of EPCM, prices are quite flexible. And I will also say that they are also not as expensive as EPC contracts. Okay, another key distinction between EPC and EPCM is that in the case of EPC, there is fixed time for completion. Of course, if the contractor fails to meet that deadline, you will have liquidated damages for failure to complete within the deadlines. In the case of EPCM, then depending on the arrangements agreed with the contractors, the time may not be so fixed. So you can have a situation here whereby the design contractor is not in alignment with the contractor that is responsible for building the projects, which then affects the time for completing the project. So as I have been hammering here a whole lot in the past few minutes, the EPC contractor holds most risk associated with that project. Why in the case of EPCM, the employer holds most of the risk. So these are the distinctions between EPC model and EPCM model. So it depends on what you want to achieve. The transaction dynamics will determine the best suitable model. But I'm going to always advise you that in doing this engagement of professional advisors to look at this project and be able to advise you on the most suitable model can never be underplayed. Please, never you joke with engaging the right people in your team to look at this project and be able to come up with with something that you can run with and ensure that the project is achieved. Okay, so bankability. No lender is going to put money on a project if after due diligence and feasibilities, both the technical due diligence, legal due diligence, and all the environmental due diligence and all, the project shows that the transaction, the project is not bankable. So here, I will be talking about some of the key bankability factors to consider or to note in your EPC. The first one is a fixed completion date. Remember, once you achieve completion, then you start generating money from that project. So a lender that is giving you money wants to be very sure that this project was, in fact, the moratorium I'm giving to this project company is going to end even before the agreed due date. That this project company will start making payments as early as possible. And that can only happen where you have a fixed completion time, right? So, which ensures that at that point in time, the project company starts generating electricity and start earning money to be able to pay a whole lot of people that are in the value chain, the O&M contractor, the lenders, and so many people that are queuing up to get hold of that payment that is coming from the off-takers. So the fixed completion date is either a fixed date or a fixed period after the commencement of the EPC contract. Of course, there are room for extension depending on a whole lot. Certain things may come into play to require the parties to extend. So for instance, you may have force majeure situations, but as much as possible, the employer should restrict the ability of the EPC contractor to claim for extension of time. Okay, another issue to risk to address here is cost overrun. You need to be able to be ensured that if we agree that this project will be done at the cost of 1 billion naira, then this project should be done for that amount. We've seen instances whereby the project at the end of the day, you are seeing 300% increment in the initially agreed contract price. So this is also a very high consideration to note in structuring your EPC contract. The risk of cost overrun and the benefit of any cost savings are usually to the contractor's account. Then as much as possible as the employer, try to push this risk to the contractor. What are we saying here? This is an EPC contract, right? I'm giving you everything to assume everything. So as much as possible, try to push this risk. But also what I would say is that, as Mrs. Kukoi said in earlier part of this slide, risk is best allocated, is best managed if allocated to the party that is in best position to bear that risk. So why the default may be to push that risk to the contractor, you also need to sit down and look at it and see whether the employer is in the best position to assume that risk. There is also the technology risk. We have seen situations whereby projects are executed and after some time we discover that perhaps the technology that was utilized for the project was not the best that should have been done. We heard that about the Ajaokuta steel industry, that the technology that was used in putting that plant into place seems to be part of the reason why the plant has not achieved the desired result. So that's also a very key consideration. Also, what output guarantee? What we are talking about here is we want someone to give us a 10 megawatts or 100 megawatts power generation plant. Depending on we've seen situation whereby for one reason or the other, when the plant is tested, the plant is unable to even achieve 70% of the guaranteed availability. So this is also a very key risk that goes to the bankability of the project. Of course, there should be considerations around liquidated damages for both delays, for either delays or non-performance. Also, the parties, as much as possible, should also consider limiting their liability as much as possible. Yes, we agree that the contractor is assuming so much, but perhaps the parties can also look at it and see how to cap that liability. Oh, okay. Now we have our power plant up and running. Another point to note here is operation and maintenance of that power plant. As we all say in Nigeria, one of the major reasons why our infrastructure is in the state it is currently is that we do not pay much attention to operation and maintenance. In most cases, you see an instance whereby once the project is commissioned, that's the end. In the next 6 months, you see the project starts deteriorating. So we can never underplay the importance of operation and maintenance of that power plant or the distribution network or whatever you are putting into place. Now, to do that, you require an operation and maintenance agreement. Now, what I will also say is it also depends on the project company. If the project company is one that has that in-house capacity, then the need of entering into an O&M agreement will be dispensed with. But a situation whereby the project company does not have the capacity to provide the operation and maintenance, then it needs to engage an O&M contractor pursuant to an operation and maintenance agreement to provide operation and maintenance services. Okay, there are key provisions or key considerations to note in that operations and maintenance agreements. Of course, what are the scope of services? The parties will need to sit down to define the scope of services. Practically, I've seen situations whereby the owner decides to assume little operation and maintenance scope and pushing the other responsibilities with respect to operation and maintenance to the operation and maintenance contractor. I've also seen instances whereby the entirety of operation and maintenance is assumed by the operation and maintenance contractor. Okay, obligations. So you also have to apportion obligations. What exactly will the operation and maintenance contractor be undertaking with respect to this project? What will the owner also be undertaking? So of course, one key obligation of the owner would be to pay the fees, right? Provide support to the operation and maintenance contractor, procure the necessary licenses that are required to operate and run the plant. Also, in the case of the O&M contractor, it is also required to provide the O&M services, procure whatever license or regulatory approval that is required from it to be able to undertake that services. So, for example, if you are talking about a power project, there is a need for the O&M contractor to show registration with NEMSA, right? Also, we also expect that you are going to have performance warranties, which will be imposed on the O&M contractor. Fees, the parties will also need to agree on fees. How do you structure the fees? What is the period of payments? Most importantly, in structuring fees, always remember that this project should be looked at from an integrated whole and not seen on piecemeal basis. Always note your power purchase agreement, you have your gas sale agreement, and your power purchase agreement is your revenue document. It is the revenue you get from the power purchase agreement you use in making payments to other parties in the value chain. So when structuring your fees, for instance, also ensure that payment cycles are structured on a back-to-back basis with your PPA. So you cannot have an arrangement, for instance, where the project company is paying the O&M contractor after within 20 days of every month. Why in the PPA, it is the off-taker is paying the project company within 40 days or 30 days. That's the fact, your project will die. So you should always pay attention in ensuring that obligations are back to back with the other ancillary contracts you've entered into in this project. Subcontracting, will the operations and maintenance contractor Hello?
Yeah, and it looks like we're losing you. I'm not sure if it's my own end, but we're losing you.
I was also thinking it was from my own hand too.
Yeah, it's your network.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, clearly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. So so whether to subcontract or not to sub.
Anthony, we lost you again. You are muted.
I'm having a little network issue. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Mm.
Please go ahead. We can hear you. Almost gone.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay, so I talked about subcontracting here. Subcontracting. So whether to subcontract or not to subcontract will be determined by the sophistication, how sophisticated the operations and maintenance contractor is. If you have a very sophisticated operations and maintenance contractor, then of course it is expected that it can assume the entire O&M services. Okay. Next point is limitations of liability. Are you going to have a cap on limitations on liability, or should the operations and maintenance contractor be liable for all, sorry, 1 second, please. Let me. Okay. Okay. So whether you're going to have a cap or limit or limitation on liability, or whether the operations and maintenance contractor will assume all liabilities that naturally flow from its default in that contract. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Okay. So I'm going to talk about original equipment manufacturer agreements. So it also depends. To put that project to bring that project into existence, now also depending on the project model, the project company may need to also procure the engine or the distribution system or the gas storage facilities and other infrastructure that will be required for that project. As such, there may be need for it to enter into an original equipment manufacturer agreement with the OEM supplier or the OEM manufacturer. So where that is the case, then the parties, there are certain things to also note. Remember, I don't want to, I would like to keep emphasizing this point. We need to see this project from an integrated whole. So in structuring this agreement, also bear in mind your PPA, bear in mind your gas sale agreement, bear in mind your operations and maintenance agreement. The OEM manufacturer should be able to supply those equipment within agreed timeline so that the power plant can be constructed, so that the gas producer can start supplying gas, so that the gas transporter can also start transporting gas, so that the operations and maintenance contractor can also start providing operations and maintenance services. So you need to ensure that the obligations are back to back. So what are the key considerations to note in an OEM agreement? Of course, the scope of the contract and the equipment. You need to understand what is the specification, what is the scope, what will the OEM be supplying to you? Is it in accordance with specifications, right? What will be the scope of its activities? Will it be responsible to manufacture the equipment and bring it to site, or will it just manufacture it and you go and pick it up? There are several things to note when allocating scope in that contract. Pricing and terms. This is also a very key point to note. Schedule for completion and delivery of equipment. I can never underplay the importance of this. I've said it earlier, that because this contract fits into other contracts, the OEM supplier or manufacturer should be able to deliver the equipment within the agreed timeline. Intellectual property, who owns that? What will be the responsibility of the project company? And what will be the responsibility of the supplier? All these are some of the key considerations to note in OEM agreements. Okay, I will hand over to Mrs. Kukoyi to just talk about key considerations for African energy projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. I think we've almost run out of time. So I'll just breeze through this very quickly. And I thought that this was important since we are talking about African energy projects. What are the typical things that we see are usually issues or challenges. Do I call them considerations here? I think, and it just follows from what I had said about why what we are doing is very important. And what we are doing here is building capacity for what we hope that our African energy projects will evolve into, given the infrastructure deficit that we have as a continent, and as our individual countries. So key things are project preparation and feasibility, very, very important. A project can't just stand on, I think a lot of the things that we've talked about clearly show that there needs to be a lot of preparation in that goes into a project before you even start contracting. And as a lawyer, or as a transaction lawyer, or as a lawyer working on a project, there are certain questions that you should ask, and there are certain things that you should know before you even start drafting contracts. Contracts by themselves are not a means to an end. They sit on top of preparation and feasibility. They sit on top of a structure, and those things should have been sorted out before you start drafting. It's very, very important. Sometimes clients come to us and say, I want you to draft the PP. And we then send them a request for information, asking them different things, because without understanding how the project is structured and different things around that project, you will just be drafting a template. Project documents are meant to be alive. They are meant to be live documents. They are meant to be documents that speak to a project and react to different things happening on the project. So that's why project preparation and feasibility is very important, and it's something that is lacking a lot on projects. And you hear things like, there is money, but there are not enough well-prepared projects. Credible sponsors and off-takers is also very important. For projects of this nature, whatever it is, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's power, the project sponsors and the off-takers, people who are, whether you are on the off-take side or whether you are the one who is sponsoring the project, need to be quite credible for you to attract the kind of financing that is required. Now, obviously, in Africa, we have a high level of government involvement. If you look at different aspects of our value chain, if you look at different aspects of energy projects, whether you're talking about oil and gas, or you're talking about gas itself, or you're talking about gas infrastructure, or power infrastructure, there's a lot of government involvement, and that's because government, for a better part, has been the funder of this in most African countries. Will that change? Perhaps not. However, we need to have better structured projects, and capacity needs to be built on both the public side, and the private side to be able to get these projects done. And that's why you have some different initiatives that even help governments with negotiating, their projects, because a project is as good as the people who negotiate it are prepared. And you actually find that most times you have a better project and better project documents when the lawyers on both sides, as long as they are aligned and are aligned in their objectives, as in having a project that works, you find that you have a richer, project document, a better project document than when it's just one side beating up the other. So it's really very important. But what I'm also saying is that with the level of government involvement, there are also risks. And I talked about the fact that sometimes it's a default payment risk. Sometimes it's the fact that it's government that is handling certain things, that they're handling certain risks that they're not able to, or private sector has been, certain risks have been pushed on the private sector, which they're not able to handle. It's a lot about risk allocation. Another key consideration around African projects is the poor risk allocation. A lot of the time we are where we are because the risks were not properly allocated, and because we assume that, the money people should take all the risk. But things that when you allow the money people take all the risk, that risk is priced. The product becomes more expensive. So there needs to be, in risk allocation, there needs to be more understanding of how risk should be allocated, and looking at what government should be able to do and what private sector should be able to do. Sometimes it's even about the fact that government doesn't do its own part that enables the private sector to do their own. And I'll give an example. I have on this slide, permits and licenses. Sometimes on a project, if the government side can only just make the procurement of project permits and licenses easier, it saves a lot of money on projects. A lot of people know that projects get to be expensive, particularly in this part of the world, because of the time it takes to get permits, because of all the stress of getting permits and all the loopholes and all the things, all the different hoops that you have to go through, the time that you have to spend, that adds to project costs. So project cost in time and money is very important. I've talked about capacity, on the side of project counterparties when I was talking about government, and private side, very, very important. Enforcement of contracts as well. We can't overemphasize, the fact that we need to have contracts in the continent that are enforceable. Even though, we also say that, what's our level of default? The fact is that there seems to be a perception about how contracts are enforced. And when I talk about enforcement of contracts, it can also be our legal systems, the ability of someone who has invested money in a project to be able to recoup that money or to be able to enforce when they struggle, is also very, very important. Payment defaults and delays, I've talked about that. The last thing I'll talk about is, long-term versus short-term contracts. I alluded to the fact that even in Ghana now, they have they have an oversupply of power, but they have signed certain PPAs for certain lengths of time. And there are many things that interplay into, having a long-term contract, and having a short-term one. And there are implications as well. If you have a long-term contract, for example, then you have to be able to meet the obligations long-term. You have to plan for it long-term. You have to prepare for it long-term. You have to be able to deal with different issues, even if you have to restructure. You have to always have that in plan and know that you have to meet your obligations long-term. But with short-term contracts, they can tend to be more expensive. So when we are talking about an African energy market and an African energy transition, the fact is that because there is need for funding and security of supply, you will tend to have to do long-term contracts. But if you are going to have to do short-term contracts, then you have to mitigate certain risks. So I thought that this was important just for us to, we're talking about African energy projects, so to consider some of the things that make them more difficult to do. I don't know who we have across the room here. Perhaps you may be on the government side, perhaps you may be on the private side. So that we all do our own part. Lawyers are very important for this thing. I know a lot of people who are on this are lawyers, but that we bear this in mind, given the current situation across the world and where we are going. I hope this has been useful, and I'm happy to take questions. Anthony, next slide, please. The question slide. I don't know, Rakiba, will we be able to take questions? We've really gone over time. I hope we can.
Yes.
There's a question from Julie.
Please go ahead. Yes, your presentation was exhaustive. Before we start taking questions, I always do a recap. Okay. But first, let me thank you and Mr. Anthony for this engaging presentation. It was really educative. Thank you so much, ma'am. To just give a brief recap of what we've heard since morning, Mrs. Kukoyi started by giving us a brief introduction of the energy contract and why it is important right now for the African market. She then went ahead to show us a typical contractual structure in energy projects where the government is at the top of that chart, and now went ahead to educate us on what a power purchase agreement is. We were also told that a PPA, that is a power purchase agreement, is the central contract that facilitates the sale and purchase of electrical power, and it is structured in different forms depending on the dynamics of the transaction. We're told that the key contractual consideration in a PPA, such as seller obligations, buyer's obligations, and access rights, condition precedents, and project timelines, to mention a few. After the PPA agreement, they took us through the gas sale and power purchase agreement, which was defined as a central contract that facilitates the sale and purchase of gas by the project company. We're then told, please, one moment, please. We were then told that a GSA is structured in different forms depending on the dynamics of the transaction, which include the term and quantity of the purchaser's demand for gas and alignment with the PPA. 2, the availability of alternative sources of gas to the purchaser. And 3, whether the seller proposes to dedicate an existing gas field or source, or dedicates new gas fields or source to supply gas under the gas supply agreement. We're also told that key contractual considerations here are the seller's obligations, the buyer's obligations to either take or pay, or the delivery points, price, invoicing, payments, gas specifications, just to mention a few. In this presentation, we're also educated on the gas transportation agreement, which is an undertaking by the pipeline operator to accept gas from a user at one or more specified inlet points. Key considerations here are the durations of the GTA, the delivery point of the gas, metering, tariffs, nominations, gas specifications, and complaints. Mrs. Kukoyi and her colleague took us through the construction contracts in energy projects, where we were introduced to the different contractual models and the constructural structure. Now, wow, this English is interesting. Of an engineering procurement construction contract, where the employer or the company is at the top of the chart. We are given the features of an EPC contract and the EPC management contract. We're also shown the comparison between both of them and the bankability of the EPC contracts. We're also made to understand that the operations and maintenance agreement governs the relationship between the project company, that is the owner, and the contractor responsible for the management, operation, and maintenance of the project. The key consideration here are the scope of the service, the obligations of the owners, obligations of the operators, the performance warranties, fees, subcontracting, the caps, and the limits of liability. Finally, they took us through the original equipment manufacturer agreement, which regulates the relationship between the purchaser or power company and the manufacturer or supplier of the equipment to be used for the energy project. Key considerations here are the scope of the contract and equipment, pricing and terms, intellectual property, responsibility of the purchaser and supplier, to mention a few. Kindly note that you can direct all your questions to the chat box or comments, and you can also raise your hand and the host will let you in. You can raise your hands so that we can unmute you and on your video, so that you can also be part of this presentation, this training. Ms. Kukoyi, someone was asking here. Someone was asking you a question here. I don't know whether you can see the question, ma'am. Ms. Kukoyi.
I think this is Galaxy A50. Is that the person?
Yes.
Okay,
Julie.
so, yes, Julie. So Julie's question, she said, my question is, how do we harness our interest in this contractual model? As well, I gained mostly is knowledge as a contract. What do we look for in drafting the agreement and the law to look into? Okay, interesting. So the way we presented this is for you to understand the key considerations. As I said in the beginning, we didn't go into an in-depth study because that would take us a few more hours. However, what I think you mean is that you only kind of understood it from the contractual side, but you may be on the other side. So what do you look out for? It's usually the, I don't want to say the opposite of it, but let me just use one. Let me use a, give me one example, limitation on liability. Now, how it typically would be is that obviously, limitation, what is limitation on liability? The contractor, as much as possible, wants to ensure that the liability is limited to the amount of their contract. So to the contract amount, that's usually what is typical. They would usually say, oh, the contract amount. Some would say, oh, maybe 50% of the contract amount. Now, you being on the other side, you obviously want to mitigate your risk, and that's where risk allocation comes in. So you want to ensure that as much as possible, whatever happens, that is not your fault. You want to make sure that the contractor takes full responsibility. But again, it's a balancing act. If you insist that they pay more than 100% or they pay for everything, it's going to raise your price up. I'm just giving you as an example. So what I would say to you is that trainings like this are not for you to know all the answers, but they are for you to do a bit more with it, to understand what it would be if you were on the other side. And you can, I'm not sure if that's going to be taken in the course of this, but what I would say is that you have to understand the concept of risk allocation more. And if you were another side, what it would be. And there's already, the good thing about it is that there's already standard practice for this. For construction contracts particularly, what I would advise you to do in terms of further reading is that you can actually look up FIDIC EPC contractual terms. They have general terms, and then they have these specific terms. Now, the general terms tend to come in a document that allows you to understand what the buyer would typically, the employer would typically want on their side, and what the contractor would typically want. So there's because this is standard in standard documentation, you'll be able to find a lot of commentaries and a lot of and even the general terms and conditions of EPC contracts. It will help you understand what you like, and then you don't obviously, again, just make it your template. You then have to situate it in that project, because sometimes with EPC contracts, for example, even though there's a template, the issue, the particular circumstances of that contract will be a bit different. So you have to think of who you are working for, who you are representing, what would work for them. It takes a lot of pragmatism. It takes a lot of understanding risk allocation more. So my advice would be for you to understand this more, read a lot more on risk allocation, read a lot more, try and get that an EPC contract, the general terms and conditions, and understand how it flows. Then you then start getting, what it would be on the employer side, and what typically would be the negotiation point on the contractor side. I hope I've helped. Anthony, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, you have. I think you've answered it.
Anybody that wants to ask facilitators questions, you can unmute your mic and make this an interactive discussion. Any more questions from the audience? Seems you don't have any questions, so Mrs. Cooper, you and Mr. Anthony did an extensive, how will I say, you made the training so educating that you've exhausted all our questions for us. Thank you so much. For lack of no more questions, I would like to end this session by, first of all, telling you that we've come to the end of this session, and it was brought to us by Centurion Law Group and Broomshy Consultancy. I also want to use this medium to say a big thank you to Details Commercial Law Firm for giving us not only one, but two people from their energy team, their managing partner and a senior partner, to educate us on contractual relations in Africa, which they really did justice to. This is the first training session that we're going to use a whole 2 hours just for the lecture. We're not adding question and answer and all that. 2 good hours for the training. And I guess that's why we don't have questions, that we're just looking at what else can we ask you, Mrs. Kukoi and Mr. Anthony, because we've exhausted everything and we are really grateful. You took time out of your very busy schedule. You see, someone just said thanks, it was insightful and enlightening. So you've exhausted all the questions I put down here to ask you. You've already answered it. So if I ask again, to be more like repeating the same thing. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Thank you. And to our audience, thank you once again for joining us today, for making this successful. Don't forget that you can rewatch this particular episode and other episodes that we've recorded over the past 4 days on our YouTube channel at Lawyers in Energy Network. Also, all presentations can be accessed through your emails. Whenever we send reminders for the following meeting, which is always done at the end of each day or in the morning before we start the session, kindly look at the links in those emails. One contains the Google Drive where all the presentations are. Right now, we have 5 of those presentations uploaded. The one for the Professor Oyinka Omorokpe, from Dr. Anzenge, Mr. Israel Haye, Ayodele Oni, and from Ndola Kukoi and Anthony. Their presentations are on the Google Drive. So, and for the video recording, just go to our YouTube channel and you can access the video recording of all the training. Please note that there is no training tomorrow, Saturday. There is no training on Sunday. There is no training on Monday, because Saturday and Sunday are weekends, while Monday is public holiday. But our training will start on Tuesday, Wednesday, take us through Wednesday, and we'll be ending on Thursday. And we also look forward to having you at that training. Finally, as to regards joining the Lawyers in Energy Network, like I've always said over the past 4 days, go to our website on www.lawyersinenergynetwork, and on the top page of the website, there's a subscription button there. Just click on the subscription button and follow the process. For our Nigerian paying clients, the subscription is 10,000, and for our foreign paying clients, it's just $20. For the foreign paying clients, you can pay into our account, that is the dollar account, and send an email to info@lawyersinenergynetwork or lawyersinenergynetwork@gmail.com. Putting in your full details, your full name, where you work, your phone number, and your email address, so that we can add you to the mailing list and our closed social media platforms. As we have 2 of such, we have the Telegram platform and we have the WhatsApp, which currently has about 400 members on those platforms. My name still remains Rakiba Oloko, and I'm the Executive Secretary of the network. And thank you for letting me moderate this session. And I look forward to seeing us all next week, Tuesday. Goodbye.